complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side, and like,
All right, Endeavor, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on, Jay. You got a great show here, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to have you on. I think that you are probably the last person who I listened to for a really long time before I stopped producing content that I hadn't talked to. So this is one I'm really excited to kind of cross off my list because, you know, I've been watching your videos and your streams for quite some time. So I'm excited to finally meet you digitally, I guess.
Oh, I'm so excited to meet you too. I just got into your stuff recently, but I've really liked what I've seen so far. So it's going to be a good show, I hope.
Well, thank you. So for members of my audience who maybe aren't familiar with, you know, who you are or what you do, could you kind of summarize, you know, what your work is on the internet?
Yeah, so I'm a blogger slash vlogger for the most part. I make generally right-wing content. I don't really put a label on myself. I've kind of passed the days where you say like, well, I'm a neo-reactionary, I'm a whatever. It's basically just broadly dissident right content that I make online. I've gotten into Substack this past year, and I've been doing my YouTube channel for the last couple of years now. So mainly YouTube and Substack. That's what I do, and I just make content on whatever subject I find interesting and whatever I think is pertinent to, I guess, this sphere that we both inhabit. And I just make videos and blog posts about most of that stuff.
Well, definitely. And I think that it's interesting, that kind of right wing with no adjectives, because it's sort of where I find myself as well. You know, I certainly come from an NRX perspective. Those are kind of my priors, but
I do too.
So much of the labeling game is it just becomes like online social clubs, and I have very little interest in that.
Yeah, same with me. I think labels should be descriptive, not prescriptive. So I don't think that you should like say, well, I am NRX, so I believe in this, or I'm a nationalist, so I believe in that or this, or well, I'm a traditionalist. I think that, you know, these labels, they should be just descriptive of someone. You know, you give your views, and then someone can use that label to describe you, and I think that's more of a useful way to use them.
Well, and I think that there's also, and this is totally not what I wanted to have you on to talk about, just to clarify, but there's sort of a shorthand that's helpful. You know, like, oh, if someone says, hey, you should, you know, listen to this nationalist blogger, you can kind of categorize that. But I exactly see what you mean. And I think that the internet sort of makes it even worse, you know, because it sort of creates these kind of like circles or camps. But one of the things that I think is interesting, we should get into this because this is kind of a core tenet of that NRX sphere, is political realism. And, you know, I read Machiavelli most recently, you know, in the last year. And the thing that really stuck out to me, in addition to kind of the things that everyone talks about, is that, you know, he is fully committed to describing the world as it is and not how we wish it to be. And I think that that's something we really need to focus on, because, you know, all too often ideology sort of possesses you into believing or being forced to believe kind of stupid and untrue things. And you sort of ran into this recently when you wrote an article about the Second Amendment. So do you want to describe, you know, in broad terms, this article and then the reaction that sort of engendered?
Yeah. So, I mean, the article wasn't really about the Second Amendment itself. It was more about kind of it was kind of about gun culture in the United States, but not even just about guns themselves. It's more about how they're employed as kind of a political device, and how people talk about them in politics, especially on the right. Now, I should say, for full disclosure, I'm not an American. I'm Canadian. However, I'm a gun guy. I like guns. I own guns. I think that owning guns is a good idea. It's good idea for self-defense. It's a great sport. It's a great hobby to take part in, much better than spending your day watching sports ball or playing video games or something like that. I'm opposed to most gun control measures. I came under fire from Justin Trudeau's gun control laws this past year. So I don't want to give people the wrong impression. I'm all for firearm ownership. I think that not only do I think that it's that you can do it, I think that you should do it. I actively encourage it. However, there's something that about a lot of the rhetoric around them that has always kind of rubbed me the wrong way. So when I started getting interested in politics around 2013, 2012, 2013 or so, I kind of got into the basic run of the mill conservative talking points. And one thing that was big in the news in those days was the issue of gun control. And this was just after this one massacre in the United States.
Would have been Sandy Hook, probably.
It was Sandy Hook, yeah. I know that if just by saying that word, you're going to get some notification.
Oh, look, at this point, it's I'm already on any list they'd want me on. But anyway, sorry.
Well, no, YouTube's just going to put a banner under your video, but who cares? So, and there's this argument that I kept seeing at the time was that, and again, from an outsider's perspective, I kept seeing that like there's people were saying that, well, if they come for the guns, then there's going to be like another American Revolution or something like that. Hitler came for the guns and Stalin came for the guns, as Alex Jones famously said on Piers Morgan's show when he appeared there after the Sandy Hook massacre. And this argument has never really sat well with me. I had always kind of just seemed like strange and like not very realistic. But then it's something that it kind of died off, and at least on the spheres that I inhabit. I don't really hear about that much from the people that I listen to, but every now and then I get some comment on my video. I get some comment saying that, well, say I mentioned something bad that happened in Canada. I get this comment that said, well, Canadians never should have given up their guns. Or I watch a video by a British YouTuber who's talking about something that happened in Britain, and they'll say, well, the British never should have given up their guns, or this wouldn't be happening. And I really kind of wanted to dismantle this idea that that widespread gun ownership, while it's something that I support, I wanted to dismantle this notion that this kind of acts as this security, this kind of insurance against government tyranny. Because this is what the right has been saying for a long time, that the benefit, the main importance of gun ownership is that, well, it gives the people political power, and that if a government ever became tyrannical, well, then it gives the people the power to enforce their will on the government physically. And I just think that's totally incorrect. I just think that that really hasn't bared itself out in reality, and I wanted to take on that issue in the article.
Well, certainly, and I think you and I are coming from a similar perspective. I'm, very much a gun guy. It's something I enjoy. And I think that there are a myriad of both like physical and kind of spiritual benefits to that, right? That's not what I want to get into. But, coming from kind of like the heartland of Red America, coming from a very conservative area, very conservative culture, I kind of grew up among these types who kind of view guns and the Second Amendment as this kind of like totemic ward against evil. And it's interesting you brought up that kind of 2012 era, because that was very much the case all through the Obama era. And my problem is not necessarily that I want these kind of militia types to lose. It's just that they are going to lose if they ever actually do what they said they're going to. And you see it, right? There's this continual refrain like, oh, well, stack up, or, oh, when they come for me, I'll go down shooting. But the problem is, as we've seen with the Jan 6 guys, that essentially they just send, if they're really whoever they are coming to get you, they send like an FBI HRT goon squad, who just rolls you up in the night and you're never seen again. Okay, maybe, you're the guy who ends up on the news for a 3-4 hour standoff. Okay, you shouldn't do that, right? For any number of reasons. But that does not a civil war make. And you see very clearly in the kind of revealed preference, when these people are called to kind of make any sort of sacrifice at all, that they're unwilling to do it. And again, I'm not framing this as, you should, lead an armed resistance against the government. Far from it. But it is very clearly not a realistic thing. It doesn't work. And it's all from this sort of, again, like kind of out of date civic mythology of, the American Revolution, and what I view as sort of an out of date political formula, right? The political formula of an older America that basically said, America is the best and we're in charge because of your freedom. And, okay, maybe you could make an appeal to that when that elite was still in charge, but that is very much not the case now. And so, it sort of goes back to a common conservative problem, which is playing, they will appeal to the rules of the game that are no longer honored. It's the beautiful losers dynamic over and over again. So sorry, back to you, Endeavor.
Well, I don't know when this idea really became prominent, because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think that Americans were talking about like overthrowing their governments with their guns by force in the 1940s or 50s, were they?
No. So this is actually an interesting point.
Like, it seems like it's something born out of like the 80s and 90s.
It basically, what it has to do is that, and again, I know this because I kind of grew up in gun culture, is that there really wasn't this, like, gun culture, for whatever that term means, is a relatively recent invention. Americans have always liked guns. There have always been collectors, but effectively the focus on guns as a fighting implement, not in the kind of pioneering sense of that, is relatively recent. And really it comes down to sort of reaction to like certain moves by the government. Like, it really all does go back to FDR. And
1968, isn't it?
34 first, but then 68 as well. Those are the two big changes in American gun control. But if you look before that, I mean, don't get me wrong, Americans have always liked guns, but not in the same way they do now. And there's another part of it, and this is 100% right, that effectively in the wake of the civil rights movement and the kind of massive increase in crime that resulted from that, that is when very much the kind of like, I have guns as a prevention against kind of like physical harm from certain populations springs up. And then you're 100% right, as the kind of social engineering aspect, and sorry, I'm speaking delicately for good reason, as the social engineering regime kind of kicked into full effect, and then also, the American right sort of was driven out of, respectable society, mixed in with a little bit of like weird, kooky American dispensationalism and kind of Cold War fear. That's kind of where you get the like prepper malicious subculture, if that makes any sense. Sorry, it's kind of a fuzzy story, but that's kind of the thrust of it.
Yeah, because I mean, it's something which I'll be honest, I don't know the history in it in an inside and out, but from what I know, that like guns weren't this kind of they weren't this wedge issue until the 1960s. So people weren't really. I mean, I don't see anything in America that like resembles what you'd call gun culture now, and kind of the rhetoric from these various Second Amendment groups or stuff. I don't really see much of that in American history prior to the last couple of decades. So it does feel like it's something that's very new. Now it's true that Americans have always owned a lot of guns and have always liked guns, but it also is something that does seem very very recent, because even when you consider something like the Second Amendment, it even says like well-regulated militia. And then when you read further into the document, it says that the president is to be the commander in chief of the militia. And it even says later on that the militia are even to be used to put down insurrections. So to defend against foreign invaders and put down insurrections. So it seems like what the people on the right today are talking about is that the Second Amendment and guns are basically it's a law that's designed to enable insurrection, which I really don't interpret the original document like that. It doesn't seem to make sense, because it seems that from the original document that the idea was that the point of the militia was to serve the legitimate authority of the state. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that that's what it meant, isn't it?
So, and I don't want to get too far into kind of the strict textualist argument, because effectively the whole point of this article and the whole point of this conversation is that it doesn't matter, right? The letter of the law doesn't matter. What matters is how it is enforced effectively. But essentially, the argument would go, and again, these are my people, so I sort of know it, that well-regulated means sort of like you would say someone has a regulated diet, as in kind of like well-organized. And that is effectively, if you look at the history of these militia groups, they were probably closer to, like, you know how like DeSantis and a few other governors have like a kind of their own personal state armies, like not quite the National Guard, but something closer than that. And also the way that they would have been organized, and this is very much kind of in the Anglo, the Anglo tradition, was effectively like a local figure of prominence would basically get together a bunch of guys, pay for their arms, and then join up. It would be something more like that. So
yeah, I mean that's kind of the thing that I imagine that it was intended for. But anyway, continue.
Well, definitely, and you're also 100% right that gun control wasn't really an issue in the same way that it is now, when it kind of becomes this kind of core issue of American politics. You know, FDR, when he passed the NFA, effectively did it as a way to counter kind of runaway violence in American cities, you know, by essentially organized crime. And so the things put in it are kind of silly and nonsensical. You know, there are things that you can kind of say like, okay, well, maybe we should ban hand grenades and things like that. But effectively, like a lot of things FDR did, it was kind of capricious and arbitrary. And really, it was not very often enforced for a very long time. You know, like a lot of the things in it, they're very, very harsh punishments for violating it, don't really become kind of effective in the same way until the 60s and 70s, which is when they really start going after people. And really, I think the other reason that there is such an intense gun culture and such a hatred of kind of the gun control arm of the state is that gun control is very often used as an excuse to get rid of people that the state doesn't like. And so effectively, gun control and gun culture can basically be seen as proxies for conservative white people in America. That's basically what it comes out to. And basically, and this is what you see at something like Ruby Ridge, you know, that the state will use violating gun control laws as basically an excuse to send a goon squad to someone's, you know, apartment in the middle, or someone's farmstead in the middle of nowhere and murder them. This is really what drove the militia movement into high gear. And obviously, you know, there've always been gun nuts, but that's really what made it kind of the hot issue it was through the 80s and 90s, and why, you know, for so many Americans, when they saw someone like Obama basically threatening them in their culture, that's really when, you know, gun culture exploded, because now it's huge. I mean, especially for people my age. And sorry, this is not at all the point of what I wanted to bring up, kind of the history of American gun culture, and it's a little bit vague, but that's sort of the long and short of it.
Well, it's good that we spoke about that, because I mean that's something that, I mean, I think you know a lot more about that than me. What I wanted to talk about in the article though was has this argument really bared itself out in reality? So you mentioned the militia movement. To my knowledge, that stuff really took off after Waco. That these right-wing militias, prepper, which, you know, prepper overlaps with prepping and stuff like that, and you know, the Second Amendment kind of acts as their foundational ideology, the idea that, well, by owning guns and by being prepared, well, you're resisting government tyranny. And I mean, one thing you can look at is if this is something that the right has been doing for the last 30 or 40 years, what was the left doing at the same time? Well, the left was producing Hollywood movies. The left was engaging in lawfare, trying to legislate from the bench, as they say, push through this legislation. They were well, they had already taken over the universities, but they were propagating their ideas through the universities. They're putting out their ideas through the media, passing these new labor laws and like getting people fired from their job who they didn't like. And they had the ADL going around, listing people who they don't like as these hate figures and all of their tactics. And when you look at that period of time, it's clear that the left won. It's clear that that strategy of taking over all of these institutions and using these arms of the state and these unofficial arms like the media, the education system, big business, using these institutions to force to basically force your ideology through and to implement them. That's been a much more effective strategy for the left than buying a bunch of guns. I think that ultimately, despite a lot of the rhetoric by a lot of these militia groups, Second Amendment groups, I think that politically they've proven to be actually quite impotent. Because I mean, you can look at we mentioned Sandy Hook in 2012, 2013. They were talking about this stuff. They were talking about armed revolution, 1776, government tyranny, socialism. Hitler took the guns, which isn't even true, but that's not important. But look what's happened over the last 10 years. I mean, if you thought that what Obama was doing in 2013 was bad, I mean, my God, think about how much worse the United States is now than it was even a decade ago. So there's been, the border's been like wide open. The Biden administration is just flooding the entire country to levels which would to exponentially high levels. The media is just being turned up to 11 with constant anti-white propaganda. The LGBT stuff is just gone off the rails. It's in every single school. It's in every single TV show. It's in the children's libraries where they have these like sex offenders in the libraries trying to perform some sexual show for children. And well, where is the pushback from this crowd? It just kind of seems like it's all bark and no bite because, first of all, I mean, what they are saying though is they're saying that when someone crosses this proverbial line in the sand, they're going to start shooting people. Now I'm not saying that they should do this. They absolutely should not do this because it's just simply not going to work. I mean, it's pretty tall rhetoric. It's pretty fiery rhetoric, but not only are they not actually following through with that, I find a lot of them aren't even really pushing back in any real way, in any way that you actually can within the law. So I just kind of feel that this entire argument it's all bark and no bite. And I think that the left has called the bluff on that a long time ago, because not only are they not afraid of the Second Amendment militia groups, or not only are they not afraid of them, they go quite out of their way to rub people's noses in the fact that they have all the power. I mean, think about what was about all the things that they'll do that it just seems like they've done it just as a way to add insult to injury. Like what's that woman's name? The fat black lady who was they had her performing with, I think it was James Madison's flute. It would have been
Lizzo,
yeah, or melting down Robert E. Lee's statue and posting that picture, which by the way turned out to actually be like somewhat of a good rallying point for us. The picture. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting what was done, because I mean, I know I'm not an American, but if there is one American that I truly have a lot of respect for, it's Robert E. Lee. I do think he embodied all of the virtues that you'd want, of courage, of gentlemanliness, of skill, of just being a great general, of being a great man of his country, even though he technically could have been considered a traitor. I think that no American today, at least no one has any reverence for the country, would consider Robert E. Lee a bad man. Well, I mean, but they do things like this. So they take someone like Robert E. Lee and they basically try to denigrate him and then rub your nose in it. And they try their hardest to show you that they're doing it. And my point is, though, that like with all the rhetoric that the Second Amendment crowd is doing, like they're clearly not afraid of them. They're clearly not afraid of these people actually taking out their guns because they know that they're not going to do it.
So one of the things that I want to slightly push back on, and this is, I think, a positive thing, is that the Second Amendment movement has been very, very successful at lawfare. That there is sort of a second tier level of organization, because the NRA is the one that gets the big highlights. But I can't remember when. There's the Second Amendment Foundation, GOA, there's a couple of these. And what they have essentially gotten very, very good at is becoming a hyper-organized single issue minority. And what they've been able to do is get wins at the state level very, very well, even in kind of blue areas. And so I think that you're 100% right on the militia types. But I do think that, if we can take one thing away from that group, it is that effectively you don't have to convince that 50 plus 1%, because we know, according to polling, a lot of things that you and I would support about guns are not actually particularly popular. They are losing propositions, but they are allowed or unbanned, kind of as the case goes, because there is this kind of like ultra, like rabid kind of a legal framework set up to push those issues. And I think that especially in a place like the US, which is where people with our beliefs, intentions, and kind of ethnic priors are fast becoming a minority, that is a very good strategy to look at. I think you're 100% right. And when you look at how, kind of power addresses the Second Amendment movement, all they talk about is militia types and the NRA. And I think that's because those are the targets they like to fight. Now, I'm going to walk that back a little bit, because if you look at these organizations, they have 100% drank the Kool-Aid on any number of social issues. Arm the queers, armed minorities are harder to oppress. 100%. I realize that. But we've seen that, this sort of strategy works. And when I think we're looking at like, okay, what is a place in which, a minority group has pushed the needle rightward? That's pretty much the only example I can think of offhand.
And fair enough. I mean, I don't have anything against someone engaging in lawfare, and because I think that that's the right strategy. And I will also add that that's actually not their guns that are getting those victories. It's actually engaging in lawfare. That's it's doing what the left has been doing actually. So it really, I mean, I wouldn't say that kind of discredits my argument, because they're not actually using guns to get these victories. They're using lawfare, which I think that's what I think that you're totally right. That's something that we have to look at. We have to look into. And I agree. I'll give credit to where credit's due. I mean, that's, I think, a positive thing. However, the thing is also that, it's also, I just don't think that, it's the be all and end all of it, because you do look at these groups and they do seem to have drank the Kool-Aid on all of these other social issues. I mean, I visited Gun Owners of America's site, and they're there telling us about George Floyd and about institutional racism and stuff like that. So while, I mean, I guess they're good on that one issue, it's not a solution really. It's not like a solution to the much broader problems. Now it's useful, because I think guns are still useful for self-defense and great for sport, but ultimately I think that I just want to get people out of this mindset that I want to get people out of the mindset that you can buy political power from a retail store. It really doesn't work like that, because even when you consider a lot of the arguments that they'll use, and I know that people will probably post this in the comment section as well. They talk about things like civil war. They'll talk about things like an armed uprising, or about how many gun owners there are in the United States versus how many police officers and military personnel there are. I think though the problem is that it misses the entire point that that stuff's never going to happen unless there actually is some kind of counter entity, some kind of counter elite, some oppositional entity that people can actually swear their loyalty to. I mean, like, you can forget about regime change or wide-scale political change without that. And you can certainly forget about any kind of. You can certainly forget about actually being able to use physical force against any Western government that you might whichever country you live in, because if you don't have some kind of organized elite to grant you legitimacy, you're just going to be viewed as a domestic terrorist, and nobody's going to want anything to do with you. And I'd probably bet that 90% of the people who are talking about, like overthrowing the government in 1776 and stuff, I guarantee that like 90% of them would view somebody who actually tried to put that rhetoric into action as a domestic terrorist, and they would want nothing to do with that person. See, because the crux of the entire argument seems to be that, like, it seems to just be on this assumption that, well, there are so many gun owners that they're just going to spontaneously form into this one army. Its army is just going to kind of rise out of the earth and then fight some civil war for them or something like that, and then depose this tyrannical regime. But that's just simply not going to happen, because, well, they're not a unified group, and there's no like entity that anybody can swear their allegiance to. And not to mention that if there actually were an armed conflict, I mean, the resources you'd actually need would be the resources you actually need for that would be far beyond what any ordinary person could afford. You certainly couldn't buy the resources to fight a civil war at a gun shop. When you look at the amount of money that's being put into conflicts like the war between Russia and Ukraine, it's hundreds of billions of dollars. So it just kind of seems like a wrong-headed strategy on the whole, that we have to be thinking about this in a whole different way. We have to think that, well, in order to actually bring about change, you do have to influence the elite class. You do actually have to have people with power and influence imbibe your ideas and decide to implement them, or you need people who hold your ideas to rise to elite status. And that's the only way you're actually going to do it. And no matter how many guns, no matter how many tens of millions, hundreds of millions of guns are out there, it can't really be utilized unless there's some kind of leadership.
Well, certainly. And we see this if we actually honestly take a look at American mythology, right? So let's start with, the American Revolution. The way that this is sold, and the way that the kind of Christian constitution, or sorry, the constitutionalist conservative types talk about this, is in bottom-up terms. The people rose up. They speak about it, in the same terms as, a Marxist would, the Bolshevik Revolution. But the problem is, it's fake. That's not true. That was a elite-led war, effectively, between two governments. If you look at the men who led it, they were very obviously the upper crust of that society. Now, skip forward 150 years, or longer than that, but my point stands, to the American Civil War, right? Yet again, this is not the people rising up. You have effectively half the government, multiple graduating classes of West Point, the military elite, deciding to break off and form their own government. This isn't a uprising of the people. And I don't say that out of some kind of like triumphant, like, your history is a lie, but just to point out that the way that these kind of, 1776 shall commence again sentiments are expressed is not based in reality. That's not how things ever work. And so if that's the strategy you're betting on, even if, which I don't believe you could, manage to gather your army of 10,000, 10 million, 100 million gun owners, that's simply not how politics works in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, what people have to understand is the concept of legitimacy. So, what is legitimacy? Legitimacy is, in political terms, it's the right to rule, and that you're recognized as within your right to rule. And what that involves is that you're recognized as the legitimate authority who is allowed to use force. in order for there to actually be some kind of revolution, uprising, civil war, whatever, there actually has to be some kind of entity which has clout of its own, that is able to actually garner legitimacy and have people switch their loyalty from one side to the other. Why is murder considered to be a grave crime, while in most cases, a soldier killing an enemy combatant in a war is not considered to be a crime? Well, it's because the soldier in the war is fighting on behalf of the legitimate power. He's been fighting on behalf of either a state, the legitimate power of a state, or in the case of like a civil war or something like that, somebody who can possibly claim to be a legitimate power in opposition to the officially recognized power. Whereas murder is just on the behalf of an individual. It's somebody doing what society has declared that an individual does not have the right to do. Unless there's actually some kind of legitimate force that people can look to and people can swear their loyalty to, any use of force, it's just going to be viewed as domestic terrorism. Nobody's going to consider that legitimate, and nobody's going to want to associate with it. And another argument I've got from a lot of people is saying that, well, in say the United States, the military wouldn't fire on their own people. The military would side with the people. Well, I mean, I think that kind of is a totally separate point from my original essay. My original essay was that, private gun ownership isn't going to be the driving force of political change. The military is an organized force with a centralized command structure. Them changing sides, then that actually is a game changer, because if the military changes sides, then things actually can happen. Things will change. However, the military is a lot less likely to change, to side with somebody who is engaging in insurrectionary activity, somebody who is viewed as a domestic terrorist. The military is very unlikely to side with that individual. And when we see other conflicts where the military has changed sides, oftentimes it's because they were ordered to fire on peaceful citizens. Because when a state fires upon peaceful demonstrators, it's viewed as, well, this state is getting desperate. They can no longer rule through legitimate means. They can now only rule through the barrel of the gun. That they can only rule through physical force. Because usually, I mean, why doesn't the military run every country? Why aren't generals the presidents of every country? Why does a civilian government control the military? And it's because there is this concept of legitimacy. This is viewed as this legitimate government, and they don't have the military patrolling the street and making sure people follow the laws. They do have police officers, but again, the number of police officers compared to the number of citizens is overall pretty small. The states rely on this concept of legitimacy, and when the state is seen as firing upon unarmed peaceful demonstrators, well, it's oftentimes a blow to the state, because they're showing that they can no longer control the population through legal means. They just have to use force. However, if it's somebody who's aggressive and it's somebody who's actually engaging in insurrectionary activity, then the state has a very easy time putting those people down and using force against them. So it really isn't even effective. It really just isn't effective to think about this in terms of, well, how many guns do people own? How many gun owners are there in the society? Because ultimately, it's going to come down to who is considered the legitimate authority, and what side do the elites, or at least a big enough portion of the elites, fall down on.
Well, and there's sort of several ways, right, that we can go through a circulation of elites, and you've brought up one, right, which is a crisis of legitimacy. And Mosca talks about the need for moral unity between the rulers and the ruled. And essentially, like you've described, if they fire on unarmed citizens, they lose that legitimacy. This is why that Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven is so important. Because essentially, if you are viewed as, simply a tyrant, you lose that soft power. Because you're 100% right. Like, a lot of the power that the regime kind of, puts out there, uses to control society is sort of informal. They don't literally need a policeman on every corner because people go along with kind of normal laws, right? Normal social order. They will self-police to a certain degree. And so that's one, right? A crisis of legitimacy. And I think one of the other ones, and this is something that I have a half-baked Substack article that I really need to finish talking about, is they sort of lose their unified elite status. They break up. They're no longer tightly organized. Because in all of this, right, and the two things I want to hammer on is looking at the world as it is, not how we want it to. And kind of a corollary from that is that core thesis of elite theory, which is that the organized minority always trumps the disorganized majority. And that's the problem with these Second Amendment types, is they are disorganized. They were a disorganized, disparate group, sort of waving their fist at the sky, saying one of these days, and every single time they put a line in the sand, it's crossed. And what comes of it? Nothing. And it would be far better for you, as this hypothetical person, not to get mad at Endeavor and I, not to make kind of Fed posty boomer, type threats towards, your fellow countrymen, but to actually go about, organizing yourself in an effective way, go about, acquiring power in a way that is not a simple kind of retail transaction. I mean, that's the way that you actually manage to do something, not this kind of false narrative of 1776, this false narrative of the revolution from the bottom.
And, I think that there's something that, because I do feel that there are two different types of people. There are the one in this kind of sphere, the Second Amendment militia types. There are some that I think are they have good intentions, but they're just misled, that they kind of just have an incorrect prescription of how things are actually going to work, and how things are going to play out. And I think that their prescription of the problem is incorrect. But there's also this other kind of more malignant sect, and it's kind of this another segment where you hear this argument from as well, and this is the types that I'm sure that I'm in my video. I got plenty of these types in the comment section, and I bet you're going to probably get some of these types too. But they kind of play the "I'm more based than thou" type. Because when they say that, well, I'm going to fight a civil war, I'm going to take out my gun, and I'm going to go do this, that, and the other. They can play this role where they're in a theoretical situation, which doesn't really exist, that they're more based, that they're more brave than you are, and that you're a coward who doesn't want to fight. But I mean, ultimately, there's two things. One is that I am a firm believer that somebody's worth to this cause that we're all part of, it comes through their willingness to actually put work into it. And very often, not only do the types who say that they're going to take out their gun and fight a civil war, very often not only are they not going to actually do that, but they're very often not willing to put in the same kind of work that someone like you or I would be, or that most people who have contributed to this for a very long time have put in. Because the notion that there's going to be this civil war, that there's going to be this armed uprising or this big conflict, it acts as an excuse to not do things. It acts as an excuse to not be productive, because if you believe that there was going to be this civil war, well then why would you start your own business and go about trying to hire like-minded people and building a community around that? Why would you bother getting into lawfare and trying to create these legal institutions? Why would you bother creating some kind of publication? Why would you bother creating this club, like the Old Glory Club, for example, which I know a lot of our mutual friends are part of? Well, why would you bother doing any of that stuff if there's going to be this cataclysm tomorrow, which is going to sweep all of that away? Well, you wouldn't, but so the people that are saying that, well, there's going to be the civil war, they're often overly black-pilled. They're often overly pessimistic about our ability to actually change things. But then also it kind of acts as this excuse to be lazy because all of the mundane incremental work that we could be doing right now, you could be getting into lawfare, you could be starting your own business, you could be creating art, you could become a commentator, though that we already have quite a few of those, admittedly. You could be starting a publication, you could be starting a club at your university or something like that. And if you can't do any of that, you could be donating to people who are. But then, if you're of this belief that there's going to be this cataclysm, well, then you kind of tell yourself that you don't need to do that because all that stuff's a waste of time because there's going to be this bloody civil war coming up. And it acts as an excuse for a lot of people to be who I kind of view as the loudest and laziest. Now, I'm not necessarily insinuating that everybody who has ever believed this belief, which I'm not insinuating that every single person who's ever been a part of this kind of Second Amendment movement, I'm not insinuating that every single one of them is like that. However, there certainly is a contingent like that. And then secondly, the other thing to add is that I also don't feel that people that talk this way are really appreciating the actual consequences of if what they're saying is going to happen would actually happen in reality, because I think very few of them actually, there's this idea that, and this is true about the boomer Second Amendment conservative types, and then it's also true about a lot of people on the dissident right that, also believe that, armed conflict, civil war is coming. I don't think that they really, none of them think that they themselves are going to possibly be killed in that kind of conflict. None of them would think that possibly their family members, if they have children, none of them would think that, are their children going to perish in this? None of them are actually taking appreciation of the very real damage that such a thing would actually do to our society. First of all, they seem to just assume that they're going to win, and they also just assume that it's going to be easy. But I mean, it certainly wouldn't be, and it certainly would be horrible. And certainly that's something that, as people who want to build a stable, healthy, and prosperous society, some massive conflict like that is something we want to avoid. But you're going to get people on the internet calling you a cuck because you said that you don't want this to happen. But really, it's kind of just this cope. It's a way that they can claim to be baser than thou and to claim to be the most courageous and the greatest warriors. But it's really kind of just all in the metaverse. It's all just talk, and it distracts people from putting in the real work that could be done.
So I am one who I hate political dualism, the idea that the right and the left are simply mirror images of each other. But I will say, this kind of smacks of the leftist revolution, the revolution.
Exactly, yes.
Just this hypothetical thing that will happen in the future when I'll be really cool, guys, I promise. And it's very easy to kind of point out the plank in, your opposition's eye and ignore the speck in yours. If I can kind of butcher that. But I think that you're 100% right that, like many things, it sort of enables, people to kind of signal how kind of committed they are, like, when the time comes, I'll be there, and to me, it very much reminds me, and sorry for going on into a biblical analogy, right? But of, the disciples saying, like, oh, Jesus, we won't abandon you. We'll be there. And then Peter very infamously denies him 3 times. And, obviously there's a spiritual meaning to that. But I think that the, the obvious one is essentially, it's a very different thing to say. Your revealed preference is very different from what you say. And I think that's something to keep in mind in all of this, that very often, as with all things, it's the people doing the most who are talking, or doing the least who are talking the most. And it's incredibly aggravating when you're someone who has a platform or has something that they have worked hard for and put a lot of effort into, and someone on their 15th banned account pops up and says, why won't you say this thing that is illegal and would get you instantly shut down? And you're like, well, because, I have something to risk here. I have something more to do than just make myself feel tough on the internet. I don't know. Sorry, maybe I'm off topic there.
Well, no. Believe me, I feel the exact same way. I've certainly had my fair share of that over the last month or two. But and the other thing is that like a lot of the people who engage in this kind of rhetoric, who will say that, well, the government never comes for my guns. Well, I'm going to shoot it out with them. Well, I mean, how much courage do they actually show in other aspects of their life? I mean, I don't know if you have ever heard of Kurt Doolittle. Do you know this figure?
So I only know who he is, actually, and I'm really showing my age here, being a Zoomer, but I only know him from a Mr. Medicare video, actually. He was on the scene before I was.
Okay. Well, so in 2018, 2019, him and this channel called John Mark, they had this ideology they created called propertarianism. And I mean, I don't need to get into what that was all about. It was kind of just like this updated version of libertarianism, but they were loudly talking about a civil war and that there's going to be a civil war in the United States. And Kurt Doolittle was, he was out there calling everyone a coward, who was saying like, look, man, this rhetoric you're engaging in is extremely dangerous. It's totally reckless. Jason from the channel No White Guilt went toe to toe with him. And he basically went and said like how wildly irresponsible it was for someone like Kurt Doolittle to come out and say and talk about civil war and about armed uprisings and even like go so far as to like tell people things that they should do to spark a civil war. But then this Doolittle figure, he was saying that he was calling everybody cowards for months and months and months. He even tried to dox the distributist because Dave disagreed with him. He was at this for about a year and a half, and then they had this IRL rally, and I mentioned this in the blog post in the video because it was too funny. It's too funny to be forgotten, but also it shows that like it does show a lot about these types on the internet. So a Black Lives Matter guy just came up to him and he literally pissed his pants. So he pissed his pants, handed over the megaphone, and then he proceeded to tell the Black Lives Matter guy how his people were greater, their manhoods were greater than his own, if you know what I mean. That he was talking about different sizes with this guy, and this is a guy who had been calling people cowards on the internet for months and months, about well over a year, and then in the real world, when he literally urinated it in his pants when just some black guy approached him and said, "Hey, give me that megaphone," and then later he abandoned all his followers and then threw them under the bus. And like the point, and the reason I'm telling this story is the point is that Kurt Doolittle is not a courageous figure. He's not someone who ever would actually show courage in reality. All of his talk about civil war and stuff like that, it was not only was it totally reckless, but it was something that he never would back up any of that. And I'm not even asking someone like that to fight in the civil war. What I'd ask of them is that they actually show the courage to stand up for their beliefs when the time comes. I'm not even asking them to do 1/10 of the things that they're claiming that they're going to do. But the reality is that it's extremely easy to say what you are going to do in some hypothetical situation, but you really don't know until you get there. You really don't know what you're going to do. So I just think that people that come out and accuse you of being a coward or accuse you of being a cuck or say how like they're baser than you, they're more base than you, and they're braver than you. Well, I think ultimately what it comes down to is how much work is someone actually willing to put in, and really like you said, they seem to be the laziest but the loudest at the same time.
Well, and it's, to me, and it's interesting you bring up the Robert E. Lee statue melting down in Richmond, because I'm from Virginia. I've mentioned it before, and the thing that really kicked off the whole kind of statue destruction narrative was actually a different statue of Lee in Charlottesville. So for those who aren't familiar with the area, Charlottesville's about an hour's car drive away from Richmond. It's a small college town, UVA, which is not quite an Ivy, but within spitting distance of it, prestigious university there, but otherwise very small. And because it was kind of a wealthy southern town, there were obviously a lot of very high-end statues there, including one in a small little park to Robert E. Lee, a very beautiful statue. This was at the center of the Unite the Right rally. And in all of that, there's kind of an ill-remembered story of this one counter protester, and he was there. I don't even think on the same day as the Unite the Right. It was another day, kind of when the statue was ritually defaced. And it was this kid, a young kid, kind of tubby looking, and he was a descendant of Confederate soldiers. And all he did was basically stand in front of the statue and just take abuse for hours. But he didn't back down. Right. And it sort of became emblematic, right, of this one kid who would actually do something for it. And I sort of look at that as much more honorable than what someone like Kurt Doolittle did. And again, that's not even that much of an ask. All he did was basically just refuse to leave. And so to me, I think that, placing your kind of energy into moral grandstanding about this hypothetical armed conflict it's just honestly, it's kind of pathetic. And the reason that I care so much about this issue is because, many of the people kind of enthralled by this narrative are good people. They're my people. Again, like I've said, I'm a conservative American from a conservative area. But when you're placing all your hope in this kind of vague, far off thing that will never happen, you're kind of ignoring the thing you could actually be doing, in the physical real world, I guess.
Yeah, and I think I think that is kind of something which people really need to take stock of. Do you know the channel Conscious Caracal? He's on Twitter as well.
Yeah, I do. Actually, I was just on his podcast not a week ago.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. And I even messaged him about this, and he lives in South Africa, and South Africa is 10 times worse than any Western country. The level of violence, dysfunction, racial strife it's way worse in South Africa. And I asked him what he thought about this, and he agrees with me. And he said the exact same thing, that he'll have people, say that because what he's part of this organization called AfroForum, and they're an advocacy group. So they engage in lawfare, they create content, they create documentaries, they do all this stuff. He's gone to Europe to voice the Afrikaner cause. They raise awareness about the issue of farm murders. They showcase the town of Arania in South Going to do all of this work. And what he'll say is that there'll be people even in South Africa who will even say that, well, it's going to be a race war. There's going to be this violent conflict. And if there's any country that's close to that, it's South Africa. But even in that scenario, you have to understand that the federal government of South Africa is still in power. There still isn't a civil war in South Africa. I mean, the demographics are much worse. The crime rate is much worse. The corruption is much worse. The dysfunction of the bureaucracy is much worse. It's the affirmative action laws are much worse. The anti-white rhetoric is much worse. And I wrote an article about this as well. I don't know if you had the chance to read that one, but what I said was that, because this is kind of a similar thing. It overlaps the idea of accelerationism. Because you'll get people who will say this to you as well. They'll say, well, when things get bad enough, then then people will take out their guns, and then there's going to be this armed conflict. Well, all I can say to people who say that is, well, look at South Africa, and it's worse than any Western country could possibly be in the next 30 or so years. Yet there still, there still hasn't been this so-called collapse. Still hasn't been this civil war. There still hasn't been any of that, because it's again just based on this false assumption that if things just get bad enough, if people just get angry enough, if the government just goes far enough, then there's going to be then change is inevitable, because, well, the people will just demand it. I mean, it just really doesn't work like that.
So, Endeavor, we are out of time. But we've mentioned that, you're a blogger, you're a writer, but if people want to find your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Oh, well, I'm still on YouTube, but most of my content now is going to be going on Substack and the website Countercurrents as well. So a lot of my Substack stuff will be posted there as well. And then I usually turn maybe the big ones, the big Substack essays, I'll turn into videos. And so YouTube still is my most popular platform. But if you want to find all of my stuff, Substack is the place to do that. I'm also on Twitter and Telegram. You can find me there and follow my posts. But and any other platforms? I mean, I'm on Gab, but I don't use it that much. So mostly it's just Substack, YouTube, Telegram, and Twitter.
And I will say, I'll add one more thing, that you and Morgoth do a series on classic movies that is quite good. It's one of my personal favorites. And I'll probably link actually a specific episode that I really have gone back to. It's the one on Dirty Harry.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's such a good episode. And it's one that I kind of find.
I think that's the one that was viewed the most out of all of them.
Huh. That's surprising because I watch almost all of them. I may have missed one or two, but yeah, they're all quite good. But I guess that isn't surprising because it's a classic movie that a lot of people have seen. And I think that it speaks to themes that are probably more current than maybe some of the other movies, right?
Yeah.
Well, anyway, man, I really do appreciate you coming on. This was a great conversation. If anyone at home wants to support my stuff, you can do that by finding my show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a Substack. I've been writing more and more. I enjoy Substack quite a lot as a platform. I pretty much put everything up there for free, so no need to pay me for that. If you do want to support the show directly, you can do that by checking out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. In addition to the kind of legions of normal people that use it, I've now heard that Dimes from Blood Satellite has signed on as a client, so you have the ability to compare yourself both to me, you want to see if you're stronger than me, but also Dimes from that show. And again, Endeavor, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on, Jay. It was great.
And everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.